Welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Erin Tinnen with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Today's webinar will be Understanding Trauma and the Body, from Theory into Practice. Our trainer today will be Lara Veon. Before we get started, I'll go over some of the technical details of the WebEx software that we'll be using for today's webinar. Many of these details are explained in the Using this Webinar System tab in the upper left-hand side of your screen. Please be aware that your screen might look a little different depending on whether you're using a Mac or a PC. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are multiple boxes. The second from the top is the chat feature. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your fellow colleagues, as well as get in contact with the trainers or myself if you have any questions regarding the training content. You may contact Jennifer Curley, also with the center, if you have any questions troubleshooting the WebEx software. To do this, click the down-facing arrow and select the person you would like to contact. You will see a lot of options, but for this session, you will want to select all participants if you would like to respond to a question from the trainer or contact me anytime during the session. You should click on Jennifer Curley to privately contact her if you're in need of troubleshooting the WebEx software. So let's test this chat feature. Will everyone please go to the chat box, click on All Participants, type in the program that you're calling from, and then press Enter. Wonderful. Thank you so much. While folks can get a lot out of the chat feature, there are times when it moves really quickly and can feel distracting. If this is true for you, you can feel free to minimize the chat box by clicking the arrow next to where it says Chat. You can always open it again with the same arrow if you choose. We will be providing live captioning during this webinar. Below the chat box, there is a media viewer box. This will contain the captions. If you do not want to see the captions, click on the downward-facing arrow next to the word Media Viewer, the same way you might if you want to hide the chat box. At the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, return to the email you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. Sometimes the sound cuts out due to internet connection, so feel free to call in if that's a problem for you. If you're experiencing technical difficulties and are unable to contact Jennifer Curley, you may call WebEx Tech Support to resolve any additional issues. That phone number, which we will also post in the chat box, is 1-866-229-3239. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will now turn the training over to Lara.
Hello, welcome. I am so excited to be here. My name is Lara Veon, and I am a body-inclusive, holistic psychotherapist and yoga teacher. I have a private practice specializing in trauma and healing in Chicago, and in addition to clinical practice, I also act as Director of Counseling for Beacon Academy, an independent high school located in Evanston, Illinois. I started my own work with survivors as a high school volunteer in a domestic violence shelter in St. Louis. This has been a lifelong journey for me. I'm really excited to share what I know with you about trauma in the body, and I will be pausing periodically throughout the webinar and asking for questions and giving us a chance to get centered and ground. Let's see. Okay, as I was thinking about what might be most useful to you in strengthening and supporting trauma-informed advocacy work, and also clinical work, if we have any clinicians present, I kept coming back to Judith Herman's first stage in her model of trauma recovery, which is that of reestablishing safety and a sense of self-care. We know without a sense of internal and external safety, it is difficult, if not impossible, for our body, mind, and spirit to operate as a whole and balanced person. Helping a survivor reestablish a sense of safety can be daunting, because trauma is so complex, it sometimes feels we're sailing in a storm, our maps co-opted completely by the gales. In the next 45 minutes or so, I aim to provide you with practical and accessible tools to help support you in your trauma-informed practices. We'll begin by defining trauma, and then we will cover the impact on the brain and body during a trauma response, as well as explore how integrating mind-body modalities can aid healing in profound ways. I've intentionally woven in several experiential exercises designed to help address overwhelm and dysregulation in the nervous system, common imbalances in survivors, and many times in those of us who help support them. These strategies will certainly act as a beginning, or if continuing, if you've already been exposed to them, toolbox for your work with survivors. And they will also support your practice and advocacy work by providing the opportunity to use your own body for enhanced awareness and to shift back into balance. So we're going to begin with a short experiential of grounded awareness. Whenever I'm talking with folks about trauma and we're working with the body, I always acknowledge that the content might trigger uncomfortable reactions. With that in mind, let's create a context of groundedness for our time here together through a brief experiential exercise I often use with both clients and with students. It will only take a couple of minutes. To begin, I invite you to simply notice how it feels to arrive here in this space from which you are joining us. Notice the seat beneath you if you're sitting and your feet on the floor. Perhaps lift your toes in your shoes and feel all four corners of your feet grounded and pushing into the floor. Notice the muscles in your legs engage as you do so. If your feet and legs aren't accessible, you can do this with any part of your body, your hands pushing into a surface and feeling the muscles in your arms engage. And then begin to bring awareness to your breath without needing to change the experience in any way. Notice the inhale and the air moving in your body, and follow the air out on the exhale. Simply inhaling and exhaling. And I'd like now to invite you to look around the space in which you are sitting and identify something that might provide what I call grounding solace in the event you experience an intense reaction. This might be an object such as a rock, a picture, or a piece of jewelry. It might even be a person sitting nearby or a pet. Perhaps it is a favorite blanket or pillow on the couch or chair next to you. It can be anything at all as long as your association to it is grounding and soothing. Mine is like the picture on this slide, a rock with the word strength etched into it. So spend a moment with this item once you locate it. Inviting curiosity, explore it with whatever senses are accessible and appropriate. Sight, touch, smell, your hearing. And continuing to take a few more deep breaths. Bring your attention back to the seat beneath you, to your feet or your hands on the floor. Look around the room and label to yourself a few things silently that you can see. So I'm looking around my room and I can see a picture, a plant, a mug. Good. We'll check in periodically throughout our time together, and I will offer you the opportunity for you to connect with your grounding item. I also invite you to orient to it with your senses if you feel intense reactions while I'm speaking. This strategy is a blend of mindfulness and self-soothing, both tools used to help regulate emotions and tolerate distress and cultivate an awareness of the present moment. Moving now into the definition of trauma, it is fair to say in our society, trauma is often avoided or misunderstood, and because of that, many survivors go without resources that could provide opportunities for connection and healing. Even those who have trauma histories don't often have a clear understanding of how or why traumatic stress shows up in the body, or how the physiological symptoms they feel are connected to events or interactions they might have experienced. Luckily, this is beginning to change as the increase in research in the neurobiology of trauma is showing us that trauma is not a specific incident, but in the nervous system reaction of the individual experiencing the incident. So the nervous system is a part of our brain that acts as a control system. And in trauma, when we perceive a life-threatening situation that we are powerless to control or prevent, it can become overwhelmed and dysregulated, meaning we're not able to return to homeostasis or balance, which is one of the functions of the nervous system. Peter Levine, the developer of somatic experiencing, which is a body awareness approach to the treatment of trauma, defines trauma as something that happens to our bodies and brain, to our nervous system, to our whole organism that doesn't unhappen. Another leading trauma researcher, Bessel van der Kolk, describes this unhappening as essentially a booby-trapping of the body's self-protective capacity that continues to be reenacted through often intolerable bodily sensations and somatic responses long after the experience has ended. An example of this that I see quite often might be a person who has experienced a violent assault and long after the assault is over might feel recurring pain in an area that was impacted during the event. The recurring pain might be activated by triggers that may or may not be recognized or understood. You might have your own examples that come to mind from working with your own populations. There are, of course, obvious and often recognized causes of trauma: war, severe emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, neglect, betrayal, abandonment, experiencing or witnessing violence, sexual violence, catastrophic injuries, and illnesses. But there are also less obvious and less recognized potential causes of trauma. Things like minor car accidents, mental and dental procedures, especially when children are immobilized, falls, minor injuries, natural disasters, in utero stress, and during the birth process, loss, and of course in a larger socio-political context, being part of a group that is marginalized or oppressed can be a cause of traumatic stress too. And it's important to note that because trauma happens in an individual's nervous system, the experience is complex and completely subjective. And this subjectivity is why we might work with two children, for example, who are growing up in the same house, witnessing intimate partner violence between their parents, and only one of them exhibits signs of traumatic stress. The subjective reaction in the nervous system, based on many complex factors. Trauma is also a fundamental fracture. It leaves survivors feeling disempowered, disconnected to self, others, community, devalued, and it leaves survivors feeling out of control. So we'll move into the neurobiology of trauma. And because the effect of trauma is so pervasive, it helps to understand what happens to us when we experience. During an event where we experience an immediate threat to ourselves or others, we feel terror, helplessness, or because of what is happening and because we are in a failure in any way to protect against or reverse the harmful outcome. As a result, our nervous system, again, our control system, goes into overwhelm and it's unable to regulate. The most important job of the brain is survival. Important to know that. There's an automatic, instantaneous, and instinctive process that happens in the brain during trauma that can help make sense of our physiological responses experienced. Knowledge of this process can help us better understand the post-traumatic response. I'm going to try to clarify with an explanation of the triune brain. We have a picture here of the triune brain, and it shows essentially the three parts of the brain. The brain's built from the bottom up. The triune brain's an evolutionary model. The oldest, most primitive part of the brain is the brainstem, the survival brain. The brainstem is responsible for regulating our survival needs: food, oxygen, heart rate, blood pressure, reproduction, among other things. It's also the home of our fight-flight response and where our autonomic nervous system, that control system we've been talking about, originates. For example, if you're standing on a corner and a bus comes by and we immediately respond by jumping back, this is the brainstem survival brain response in action. It's an instinctive response in your brain to do whatever it takes to survive. The second part of our brain, the limbic brain, the limbic system, is a complex system that's not easily described in a few short words here. It's essentially our feeling brain. It's in our mammalian brain, so evolutionary, it's the second part of the three-part model, where we get the sensory input, which tells us whether we should be happy, sad, or feeling any type of emotion, and then it links that with behavior. The key task of this part of the brain is to look out for our welfare, and it will release hormones if it detects danger, or even pleasure, different hormones in that case. It also operates on a subconscious level. The brainstem and the limbic system are often referred to together as the downstairs brain. The newest part of the brain, which is referred to as the neocortex or prefrontal cortex, is the thinking brain. It's responsible for higher learning, executive functioning skills, empathic understanding, and a sense of time and context. It operates mostly on a conscious level and is often referred to as the upstairs brain. When a person is experiencing traumatic stress, they are in the downstairs brain, and the upstairs brain is not accessible. It's essentially offline. And this is also happening when a person is experiencing a traumatic trigger or a traumatic memory. And so that higher order thinking brain that we need to help us make sense of time and space and context is really offline and not accessible. As you see here in this next slide by Janina Fisher, a trauma expert who teaches at the Trauma Center in Boston, is on the faculty also at the Sensory Motor Psychotherapy Institute. She was generous enough to share this with us. You can see that it requires bringing that thinking upstairs brain back online in order to understand when one is experiencing a trigger or memory, and that it's not happening in present time. So many times you might be working with survivors who are indeed in a dangerous situation and experiencing traumatic situations, and their safety, that external safety that we talked about, is instrumental, is a priority. Other times you'll be working with survivors for whom the experience has passed, and yet they are still experiencing flashbacks and memories that make them feel that they are still in danger. And the challenge of advocacy work is that many times you will be working with survivors who are actually experiencing both at the same time, which is an extremely challenging situation to deal with. And this is where your tools to help survivors regulate and come back to the present moment will provide most useful, because in a sense it allows them then to be in the driver's seat, to have control and to understand and be aware of reactions that are happening in their body, and then have control to impact change. So we'll talk a little bit more about the autonomic nervous system, the ANS, which originates back in that brain stem, which was the first part of the brain, the reptilian brain, the oldest part of our brain. And all functions in our body are linked to this single regulatory system called the ANS. There are two branches that you can see here in this slide. The sympathetic branch acts as the body's accelerator and is responsible for the stress response, which includes that fight or flight response. The parasympathetic branch serves as the body's brakes and is responsible for the rest and relaxation response, the response that helps bring us into balance. When our bodies are experiencing a stress response, we go into survival mode, which means that all of the systems that are not necessary for survival start to shut down or diminish. Again, the parasympathetic nervous system, the system responsible for rest and relaxation, and that helps connect the downstairs brain to the upstairs rational thinking brain, is completely offline in those moments. Essentially, the body is in full acceleration without the brakes. When this stress response happens repetitively, the nervous system can become hyper-aroused. It can go into overdrive. So if you think of a car with too much gas, it's going into overdrive. The system could also become hypo-aroused and shut down. In order to regulate enough so we use our thinking brain, we have to bring the parasympathetic system back online and into balance. And we're going to talk more specifically about what the nervous system looks like when it's dysregulated in this next slide as we explore the trauma response cycle. Before we move on, though, it might be a good time to pause, reorient to the object that we talked about that might help ground us. Spend some moments here, again, feeling a part of your body against a surface, bringing awareness to your breath, to the air coming in your body and the air leaving it. And taking a couple of breaths here. And Jen and Aaron, I think I'd like to ask if there are any questions for clarification before we move on into the trauma response cycle.
We don't have any questions at the moment, but if folks do have questions, they can post them in the chat box and we can hang on to them.
Okay, that sounds great.
Thanks, Lara.
Sure. All right, so then we'll move on. And again, I invite you to send any questions that you might have for clarification into the chat box. And we'll move on into the trauma response cycle. So what happens during a trauma response? And sensory information about the external world arrives through our senses. We've been working with senses to help us regulate. Basically, how we absorb the world is through our senses. And they converge in the part of the brain that's called the thalamus, which is an area in the limbic system. And it's passed on to the amygdala, which is the brain's fear system or fire alarm, which is also in that limbic system, the feeling brain. If the amygdala is activated, as it is in the trauma response or post-traumatic stress response, once it sounds an alert that there is a threat, a stress response instinctively and quickly becomes initiated in the body as it moves into survival mode. And this is what we mean when we use the term fight, flight, or freeze. Fight is clearly fighting back. We're hyper-aroused. We're fighting, moving towards the threat. Flight is when we flee, we move away from the threat. And freeze is a response that occurs when fighting or fleeing is not possible. And I must point out that it has special meaning for survivors of attacks or immobilizing events because they may be haunted by flashbacks and other memory fragments after the event stops. Freeze is called the dorsal vagal immobilization. It's a process in the brain. It's actually controlled by a very old part of the parasympathetic branch. And it's most likely to engage when physically immobilized. For example, pinned down by an attacker or when a child has no escape from an abusive caregiver. And I want to emphasize that the freeze response is just as automatic as fight or flight. And yet, because sometimes it looks and feels like submission, it can carry more shame and judgment from self and others around one's powerlessness to escape the threat. These judgments can then become negative self-talk and impact emotional and core beliefs about oneself greatly. So as we discussed earlier, when our body's stress response is initiated, and we move into this fight, flight, or freeze, our nervous system brakes are off. There's a chemical process that happens. Chemicals like norepinephrine, stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol are released in the body. The function of these chemicals and hormones is not bad. Their function is to actually prime the body to fight or to flee, basically to survive. Again, the freeze response is initiated if that's not possible. But these chemicals and hormones can become toxic to our battery, almost like battery acid, or to our body, almost like battery acid when our nervous system's dysregulated too often or for too long. And that contributes to illness and pain and weakened immune systems. We'll talk a little bit more about what that might look like a little bit later. There are a few other functions at play in this fear response. The hippocampus, so the part of the brain that gives time and space context to an event, and it puts memories into proper place and perspective in our life's timeline, that part of the brain becomes suppressed. And it can then account for disrupted and fragmented memories. I kind of imagine the hippocampus as our brain's filing cabinet, and during and after trauma, the files become messy, they become out of order, they're often hard to find. When we're working in advocacy, we often see this in accounts from survivors or when they're asked to retell their story and those details are hard to find. That's because the hippocampus isn't really filing these experiences in any sort of order to make them understandable. The area responsible for language production and comprehension shuts down as well. And we account for memories that exist in the body without access to language to explain them. So sometimes we experience these memories as uncomfortable sensations whose origin aren't easy to understand. So it's really working at a level beneath language comprehension and production, which makes it very difficult to use traditional talk when trying to heal or move through the trauma. So what does a trauma response look like? Looks like stress. I think we all are aware of what stress can look like. Shallow breathing, rapid heartbeat. It could look like trembling in the body, a sense internally of stomach dropping, or a sense even of being in a dream, which we call dissociation. Sometimes you might notice dissociation if you work with survivors in groups and you notice that they're staring far off into the distance and they're not really present in the experience of what's happening in that moment. That's a form of dissociation. And that too is a body's protective defensive response. This stress, the trauma response also looks like an increase in adrenaline that we talked about a little earlier. That impacts our immune system, and all of these systems that are not necessary for survival, again, remember they become inhibited. So immune system becomes inhibited, our stomach acids increase, our salivation becomes inhibited, blood flow to areas like skin, digestive tract, sex organs, those become inhibited as well. We often see presenting some somatic symptoms around the digestive tract. Basically, any system not necessary for survival automatically goes offline. And after the experience causing the trauma is over, the effect is often seen, again, in those fragmented memories we talked about, heightened emotional reactivity, flashbacks where no time or place is encoded in the memory. So when we're in the midst of a flashback, it feels very much like that's happening in the present moment. Limited cognitive abilities are also a reaction. We can become very concrete and unable to hold multiple perspectives. And this can be very challenging when trying to deal with the issues that are coming up in our life. The body can also become stuck in hyperarousal or hypoarousal when the nervous system is unable to regulate from a trauma response. We'll talk a little bit more about the levels of reactivity later. But while these states look different, hyperarousal and hypoarousal are both functions of the autonomic nervous system that we've been referencing. The sympathetic branch that's responsible for the body's instinctive fight, flight, freeze response, and that is activated when the brain sphere system, which is the amygdala, indicates a threat. It's important to note that the amygdala in traumatized individuals becomes highly sensitive and overactive. So situations that are not threatening may be perceived as highly dangerous, and their brain and their nervous system will respond as such. An example might be a young girl who witnessed gun violence, and even though the experience is over, each time the girl hears a backfire, she responds in her mind and in her body, including the flow of chemicals released in her brain, as if she were being exposed to gun violence again. This response is instinctive and it's instantaneous. Those who experience hyperarousal, so intense activation, that fighting or fleeing, freezing, they often describe symptoms such as anxiety, panic, hypervigilance, a heightened startle response, restlessness, digestive problems, emotional flooding, chronic pain, and mood variability. Those stuck in hypoarousal may describe feeling depressed, lethargic, disoriented. They might experience frequent dissociation, having low blood pressure, poor digestion. And it's very important to understand that these symptoms of trauma are physiological manifestations of our body's instinctive response to defend and protect itself. This is the reason we can't tell ourselves to just get over it and feel better. People who are survivors of trauma experience these reactions, are in fact almost hijacked by them, and they linger and affect their daily lives long after the traumatic incident has ended. This is why trauma survivors often behave and react to the world as if under siege, which is another phrase used by Bessel van der Kolk, which perpetuates dangerous and threatening feelings of powerlessness, disconnection, and being out of control. As helpers, we're not always aware when those with whom we're working are experiencing symptoms of hypoarousal. We don't always know when they're triggered, and they do not always have the language to inform us. And that's why it's so pertinent to see through a trauma-informed lens and have a variety of strategies to try. It's also important to note that not all of the strategies will work for every person. They help us shift arousal states, so survivors and anyone using the strategy can feel more in control of their experience. And because so many survivors of domestic violence are living in danger and experiencing flashbacks and traumatic memories, having access to some of these strategies and a space where someone can help lead them and practice them is vitally important. There are various levels of stress reactivity a survivor might experience based on their dysregulation, and this goes down to the last point, goes on the slide here, the stress, traumatic stress, post-traumatic stress, and complex PTSD. General stress is really any demand on the body system. It might be an event, a spike in arousal, and then a settling that happens. The body is able to tolerate it. You know, in a well-regulated nervous system, the stress happens, you know, periodically throughout the day, and it's tolerated relatively easily. But when we're working with survivors of domestic violence and more pervasive trauma, traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress occur when the impact of the experience is longer lasting or more pervasive or more repetitive. So in addition to dysregulation, intrusive feelings, and urges to interrupt a person's functioning, the arousal actually spikes and might get stuck in that hyperarousal state or hypoarousal state. Complex PTSD is often the result of multiple events or even a lifetime of traumatic events. Sometimes you'll work with people, and I'm sure you can all identify some people that you've worked with who have had a series of traumatic events, and they haven't had the resources to heal from them before the next one. And so the nervous system responds and becomes hijacked a little into a trauma response. In advocacy work, we see PTSD and complex PTSD quite a bit, unfortunately. Once we really understand this trauma response cycle and the potentially pervasive impact of it, and we have a general working knowledge of the nervous system, we're in a place where we can start integrating the tools that bring that rest and relaxation response, the parasympathetic nervous system, back online. And this ultimately helps the nervous system regulate. It's the key to achieving balance and peace. It's also important to note before we start integrating it that relative balance and peace doesn't always feel good to every survivor, particularly if a survivor has spent time in a state of hyperarousal. The nervous system becomes patterned to be used to that almost. And so bringing the body into balance takes practice, and it takes gentle and patient titration and exposure to some of these skills, because it might be further activating to throw a nervous system that's used to being hypervigilant and in a state of fight or flight into a place of peace. It feels very unsafe in some moments. So again, without knowing how the nervous system is working for each of the survivors with whom you're working, these are important pieces to just be aware of. Okay. All right. So I think we're going to do another experiential here, and we know a lot about trauma now and about the physiology and the neurobiology of it. We went through the body's instinctive reactions and its innate desire to seek balance. And there may be examples of your clients or group members cycling through your head. I know every time that I talk about these things, I see images of my clients that have been working on healing. And your brains might be full and busy, and that would make sense after the amount of information that we just covered. So before we move on, let's take a break. This time with the sensory mindfulness exercises I use often with my clients and my students to reorient them to the present moment. Using a definition by Jon Kabat-Zinn, author and the creator of mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness is awareness that arises through paying attention, on purpose, in the present moment, non-judgmentally. I know that there's a wonderful webinar from last September in the Center series by Dr. Marianne Dutton on using mindfulness with trauma survivors, and I recommend listening to the recording for a more in-depth exploration. All right, so let's begin again by noticing your feet on the floor, your hands pushing against the surface. If noticing your breath is accessible, continue bringing awareness to the air coming in your body, and on the exhale to the air leaving your body. Again, without needing to change the experience in any way. Take a few rounds of breath here. Now, look around the room and label 3 things to yourself that you can see. Notice the color and the shape. Continuing to breathe in and out. Now bring awareness to 2 things you can hear in your space. And lastly, bring awareness to 1 thing you can touch with your fingers and your skin. It might be the texture of your clothes or of the chair beneath you. It might be the wood or the surface of your desk. It doesn't matter what it is. Simply allow yourself to spend some time breathing and noticing the texture of something that you can feel. And now shift back to listening in your space. Reorient to 2 things you can hear. And then back to 3 things you can see. Good. This exercise is easily adaptable. You can change the senses you use. If you have flowers or essential oils nearby, for example, you might decide to use that instead of sound or touch. Or if you feel those with whom you are working need more guidance, you might go ahead and determine which objects they focus on. This might happen if you're using this exercise individually with someone who's in a high state of activation. They may need you to identify the objects, to see, to hear, to touch for them. But the options for modifying this exercise are really endless. So why don't we take a moment and reflect individually on how you might use this experiential exercise in your own practice. You can write it down or make a note or share it with someone in your room. And we'll just take 1 minute to do that. Okay. So we'll move to the next slide, bringing the body back to balance. The picture of a cairn built here on our very own Chicago beach. When we defined trauma earlier, we discussed how trauma is a fundamental fracture, that it leaves survivors feeling disempowered, disconnected, devalued, and out of control. Why do we use the body to shift to a more balanced state? Because as Bessel van der Kolk is infamous for saying, the body keeps the score. These visceral practices work to bring the parasympathetic nervous system back online. They help shift people out of the fight or flight state. They help reorganize our perception of danger, which can become skewed in trauma, and increase capacity to manage relationships. The body holds these responses. And so using the body to move through them and to heal with them is a tangible, accessible practice. There are countless body-inclusive practices like breath work, chanting, group dancing and singing, and yoga that rely on interpersonal rhythms, visceral awareness of the body, vocal and facial communication. These practices can guide one back to a wise, compassionate, and empowered self. These techniques are also helpful because the area of the brain that processes and comprehends language, again, is not accessible during trauma. So as such, it's important to incorporate modalities that do not solely depend on language as a means for expression. The mind, body, and somatic approaches to trauma recovery go by many names. Somatic psychology, somatic experiencing, body-centered therapy, stress reduction and relaxation methods, and many other approaches that honor the vast experiences and needs of survivors. These are yoga, mindfulness activities, guided imagery, dance and movement, expressive art, acupuncture, energy work, and chiropractic medicine even. While different in strategy, all of these approaches are tools that intervene at the limbic system to help regulate, balance mood, and improve the problematic symptoms of post-traumatic stress. Many of them help survivors cultivate the ability to remain in the present, to notice and tolerate inner experience, and to be able to develop a new relationship with their body, thus reestablishing the sense of safety that is so imperative when one has experienced trauma, or, as we've been discussing, is also currently experiencing a traumatic situation. Whether you're in a courtroom as a legal advocate or facilitating a group at a shelter, having body-inclusive tools in your toolbox provides efficient and accessible opportunities for balance, and they're relatively simple and quick. Let's try another one. And this exercise works to bring the parasympathetic nervous system back online relatively easily, kind of bypasses the need to even judge it or have a narrative around it. So to begin, before we do this, give yourself a number on an activation scale of 1 to 10. 1 is totally relaxed, and 10 is you feel so activated you're ready to flee away from this webinar. And either write that down or just note it in your head. Okay, and now we'll start a breathing exercise where I will cue you to count to 4 on the inhale and to 6 on the exhale. I'm going to repeat this cycle 3 times. So we'll begin. Inhale, 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, inhale, 2, 3, 4, and exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. One more time. Inhale. 2, 3, 4. And exhale. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And go ahead, releasing focus on the count. Take a deep breath in and just let it fall out, clearing it out of your lungs. And check in with your scale. Again, 1 being the most relaxed and 10 being highly activated. And see, write down your number and just notice if there's been a shift. Again, no judgment if there hasn't. It's a practice of awareness. Why this experiential is so helpful is that long exhales slow down the heart and relaxes the muscles. Counting also provides a nice opportunity to add mindfulness into the experience. So staying present with the count alleviates the opportunity to be in a place of worry about something in the future or something in the past that might be happening outside of that moment. So bringing it back to a count can help aid present awareness. So why don't we take another moment and whether it's journaling or just jotting something down, reflect on where you might use this, with whom you might use it in your practice. Okay. All right, so this next slide, we're going to talk about neuroplasticity. As a therapist and from my own experiences, I know that humans have an innate capacity to heal. The body is designed to heal itself. We are resilient beings. We move from suffering to joy through complex and sacred journeys. I don't need science to help me with this, and yet it does explain why we can heal, and that's helpful. The current developments in the field of neuroscience research provide immense hope with the discovery of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is a concept which essentially means our brain has the ability to change as a result of one's experience. It's hardwired to rewire. And this is great news. It means we no longer have to believe we are forever at the mercy of our painful symptoms. We've all heard the term, oh, hardwired for that. And yet what we know is that that's a little bit of a concept of the past. So we know that true trauma damages the brain. We know it is true that trauma damages the brain. However, what we know from neuroscience now is that the damage can be healed. We are not hardwired to have those physiological responses and reactions. The reactions and patterns created by trauma exposure can change and move survivors towards balance, healing, and wholeness. And when we repetitively use the body-inclusive practices to shift back into a state of balance, we're creating new neural pathways that lead to wholeness. Recently, I went to Austin, Texas to study meditation and neuroplasticity with Dr. Joe Dispenza. And in our session, we actually saw a video of the brain, of the webs in the brain, of new neural networks being created through synapses firing and the old ones actually pruning away. And neurons that fire together do indeed wire together. And so it takes repetitive, consistent practice to change the brain. I'll move into another experiential, but it uses the power of breath and nonverbal language to influence your body on a chemical level. And Amy Cuddy is a social psychologist, and she's quoted here on the slide as saying, when we think of nonverbal, we think of how we judge others, how they judge us, and what the outcomes are. We tend to forget, though, the other audience that's influenced by our nonverbals, and that's ourselves. She's a social psychologist from Harvard Business School. She created a test to determine how much posture affects confidence. She asked study participants to position their bodies in high power and low power poses for 2 minutes. On the slide, The pose on the left is a high power pose, and the pose on the right is not. Researchers then assessed the risk aversion and body chemistry of those participants, and they found some really fascinating outcomes. 20% increase in testosterone in the high power pose. Testosterone is a hormone that influences how assertive you are. It was also a 10% decrease in that in the low power pose. In the high power pose, there was also a 25% decrease in cortisol, the stress hormone that we talked about during a trauma response. The low power pose had a 15% increase in stress. So how we position our bodies actually changes the chemistry of them. Amy Cuddy's slogan is "Fake it until you become it." Connected to the idea of neuroplasticity, it's really neuroplasticity in action, actually. Repetitive practice of a power pose will create new neural pathways of more confidence and lower stress in the brain. I actually presented the pose to my entire student body recently, and they were so excited to know that they had the power to shift their levels of stress with such an easy experience. They were suggesting situations where it might come in handy, before tests, before interviews, social interactions. And because dealing with the legal system can be so triggering for survivors and advocates alike, this exercise might actually be a good one to do together. So we won't do the full 2 minutes, but I would like you to stand if possible or to sit in your chair and take up a lot of space. So spreading your feet hip width apart, your arms at your hips like in the picture, widening your chest by bringing your shoulder blades back and down your back, your chin up, and taking a breath in and noticing how it feels to be in this pose. Bringing your hands down is actually very similar, hands down by your side, to mountain pose, which is a yoga pose. While you're doing this, you can pay attention to your feet on the floor, so it becomes a grounded, centered pose. And what we know from yoga is that that also contributes to low stress, less stress in your system. So I'll invite you to play around with this pose, maybe test it out in your life, and perhaps use it with the survivors that you're coming into contact with. In this pose, and using it together actually brings us to the concept of co-regulation, which is essentially the ability to use the resources of another to help regulate. Co-regulation can often bring down our level of arousal more rapidly than self-regulation, which is being left to our own devices, because the latter actually requires on some level to think it through, which is the top-down processing. It's using the upstairs brain. Being with another, on the other hand, can help co-regulate because it bypasses our thinking brain, so it's more bottom-up processing. It uses that limbic system. For people who have experienced trauma and fear, attachment failure can be an inevitability, and the experience of trauma can leave its mark on all subsequent relationships, including the relationship with the helpers, the advocates, therapists, supporters. Trust and closeness is not necessarily experienced as a haven of safety. In fact, a traumatized person often develops fears associated with those helping relationships. This might present challenges in your working relationships as a result of the survivor's vulnerability to affect dysregulation, which might mean as an advocate, you actually have a greater responsibility and access to strategies that can help balance the nervous system so the person with whom you're working can regulate. Group and rhythmic practices are useful for co-regulating. Even a game like the hokey pokey or free dance where partners mirror each other can allow us to be with each other as we move into a state of balance. Of course, not every member in a group will be regulated after an exercise. In many ways, we plant seeds that might bloom when we're no longer there. Or a more scientific way to explain it is that we're beginning to help survivors create new neural pathways that with repetitive practice will change their nervous system's ability to balance. This awareness and practice can at times come at a personal cost because, to be quite honest, it takes much energy to be compassionate, patient, and consistently balanced. These strategies I've shared today are as important for us as helpers as they are for those whom we help. If we don't have the ability for self-awareness and an active practice of self-care, we will not be able to sustain our work and relationships in a healthy way. When we experience compassion fatigue or vicarious trauma, our symptoms can often mirror those that occur in a trauma response. We can also become dysregulated, disempowered, and disconnected. When working with survivors who are hurting so much, the helpers often tend to minimize their own needs, and this can be dangerous. As Audre Lorde states in the quote, self-care is an act of self-preservation. I know there's another webinar in the Center series that focuses on self-care, and I highly recommend checking it out. In closing, I'll interject one of my favorite metaphors for a trauma survivor, that of the Japanese art kintsugi. The essence of this art form is about the power of transforming broken ceramic pottery into beautifully resurrected masterpieces using glue laced with gold. It is true that life sometimes breaks us. Experiences shatter the person we know ourselves to be, and we often become unrecognizable to ourselves and sometimes to others. As we heal, we start putting the pieces back together. And our healing journey is much like the epoxy laced with gold. We end up creating a beautiful, once broken and now healed masterpiece, one that's much richer than that from which it came. Each of us is breaking, and I can guarantee every human being on this earth is in some capacity. But each one of us has the ability and resilience to become a stunning piece of art laced with gold. I think we have a couple of minutes if there are questions. Thank you very much for spending time here. I do have some resources and references that I've used on these slides. I always like to make sure that I cite the rock stars that helped contribute to this information, and my contact information is here. Jennifer, Erin, are there any follow-up questions or?
Yeah, so we only have a couple of minutes, but one person asked if you could potentially go over the upstairs and downstairs brain example again briefly, and if folks have additional questions, they can follow up with you or with us after the webinar.
Sure. Let me find it here.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So the upstairs and downstairs brain, the brain stem and the limbic brain, the part of the brain, the oldest part of the brain, and then the next part. So the brain stem is the oldest. It's our survival brain, fight or flight. And then our limbic brain, which is the feeling brain. These are called our downstairs brains. When we're in a trauma response or a state of fear or high stress, these are the parts of the brain that are active. The higher upstairs brain, which is the higher order thinking, the thinking brain, which is often what helps us make sense of an experience, that's pretty much offline. So we need to find ways, which we've been doing today, to bring it back onto line, to connect the upstairs brain with the downstairs brain. That was a pretty simplistic explanation, so I'm happy to explain that in greater depth via email.
Excellent. Thank you so much for going over that again, and thank you again for everything today. We're going to wrap up, so thank you so much, Lara, for an exceptional webinar today. I'd like to thank you. Oh, absolutely. I'd like to also thank Caption Colorado for providing today's captioning, and thank you to Jen Curley and Angelica Medina for making the webinar run so smoothly. Last but not least, thank you all for spending your time with the Center. Within the next week, I will send a follow-up email with a link of the recording of today's webinar in addition to all of the slides and handouts that were referenced that will be available on our website. And you will all also receive a certificate of attendance for your time today. Additionally, if you have a moment, we would be really grateful if you could go and like us on Facebook. This week, Angelica will be sharing resources and videos related to today's webinar that I think lots of you might be interested in checking out. So do that if you have a moment, please. At the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. If you could please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better, we would really appreciate it. And thank you all so much. We hope you have a great afternoon.